We're here at the 2016 IAB AddUp Summit, where we just wrapped our town halls talking about the industry's most pressing issues. Let's hear what they had to say about whether we're truly measuring ROI.
We are just out of the comScore session on Are We Measuring What Matters, where we talked about all the different things that we're measuring in digital and have we lost sight of the ultimate prize, which is ROI. We had, I thought, an invigorating discussion where people either agreed or disagreed. So Rohit, what was your biggest takeaway from the session?
Well, it definitely was a lively session for sure. I think we had a lot of opinions in the room. I came away feeling that there's a lot of awareness about digital marketing and programmatic in general within the room. I think we're talking about concepts that a few years ago sounded alien when we walked into a room and spoke about these. Viewability, closed loop measurement. I think we had a good discussion on them. And I think that's what, for me, kind of was the biggest takeaway, was that we are now talking to educated digital audiences, both on the buy side and on the sell side.
Yeah, it was interesting to me. We talked a lot about viewability. I think at every digital conference we talk about viewability. I think that people are trying now to push sort of through viewability to get to the ultimate performance of the campaign. And there's a lot of commentary along the lines of, if you measure the effectiveness of the campaign, then things like viewability or fraud, those are a means to an end. But ultimately, if the campaign works, the campaign works.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you touched upon an interesting point there. And I think we talked about it during the session too, that viewability is a means to an end. What we've seen is that when we talk about viewability alone, in a DR focus, we tend to see that when we optimize for viewability, there may not necessarily be that ROI that we are looking for because we didn't look at something like ad fraud. We have seen in the past that when viewability goes up, ad fraud goes up. And I think it's very important to look at viewability as a means to an end, to look at it as a step in your measurement funnel, but optimize to it only to the extent that it meets your DR goals. Yeah. And that's the end line that a lot of advertisers that we work with, we promote, and we essentially ask them to look beyond just viewability as a metric, to look at ad fraud, to look at site, to look at targeting, and then build an assumption about how viewability fits into the larger measurements.
Yeah, and I said this in the session, one of the things that we've seen is exactly what you're saying, that when viewability goes up, oftentimes fraud goes up. And the reason we've seen that, or it's almost like the other way around, when we do a better job of filtering for fraud, viewability goes down, and that's because the fraudsters have gotten smart and they're trying to simulate a viewable impression. So the better job you do of identifying fraud, the better job you do of catching what would otherwise be counted as a viewable impression.
I agree, and I think viewability becomes more of a metric for us when we talk about larger brand campaigns. When we don't necessarily have that net of going back to a DR goal within a multi-touch attribution model to say that viewability to a certain extent matters and beyond it is not so effective. But I think when we start talking about the mid-funnel, when we start talking about some of those more expensive buys, and I think that's where we tend to look at softer metrics, and viewability is one of those for us. We are now trying to build in brand studies and making sure that we use viewability as a negotiating tactic, as a buying tactic, but also measure it on the measurement side with brand studies.
Yeah.
So I think viewability takes on a slightly more important focus when we talk about the more expensive, the more encompassing IO-based negotiations.
Yeah, and then when you move out of DR-type response and into brand metrics.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you one more question, because I thought this was interesting. One of the things that came out in the session was that the room generally believed that more digital advertising dollars are placed against traditional age-sex demography than against advanced targets. And I thought that was interesting. One reason is because in the TV marketplace, actually the trend is the other way around. Obviously historically it's age gender, but there's a trend towards advanced demography, advanced targeting to compete with digital. So I thought it was ironic that digital's going age gender and TV's going targeting.
I was definitely taken aback by the reaction in the room, especially given where programmatic's heading. And the proxy for programmatic is data-based behavioral targeting. 70% of all programmatic display spend is programmatic. So it was interesting to see that there were audiences in the room that were talking about age and gender as a metric for buying digital media, which is now getting more and more programmatic. But I think some of them made an important point. I think it was about finding the right audiences. So starting with a large enough net, especially if you have a large budget, and then starting to come down in terms of what your targeting looks like is another tactic that we've seen other advertisers use in the past. But I think what worked in the past can work better in the future with a slightly more nuanced approach to targeting. I think age and gender still makes sense, but I think there's also a lot of other data signals that we talked about. The fact that there's so much data out there that we can use all of that to overlay on top of your age and gender and all of those traditional metrics that advertisers have relied upon for so many years now to make those buys more efficient.
And I guess I would probably just say, sort of in closing, that there are a lot of metrics that we can look at, but ultimately, if we keep our eyes on the right metrics, on the performance of the campaign against the advertiser's objectives, then I think a lot of the intermediary metrics kind of fall into line.
Yeah, I think that's where we've started to move away from these directional metrics and these directional insights towards larger campaign goals, whether that's brand favorability, whether that's a sales goal, and talk about what's a more and more a closed loop measurement. I think we're facing some challenges there. We have seen that when we drive, or when media drives traffic to stores, when we use a lot of media to drive offline sales, making that connection back to not just one type of media that drove to a location, but also your entire media funnel that contributed to someone walking into the store. So I think we've done a great job of looking at measurement when it comes to a macro channel level. So I exactly know from a search, display, down to a partner level, what the true value of the media is that they drive. But a lot of that is digital. And a lot of that is not as granular as we'd like. But I think what's then a more difficult challenge for us to solve is the offline piece. Having location-based performance drive back into all our media and then attributing that back in a scientific manner so we can learn the true impact of media across a brand and not just one goal is really what we hope the industry will solve as we go ahead.
And when you say location-based, you mean tracking that you're driving people to stores?
Absolutely. So we now have the technology, whether that's DMPs that have now enabled offline store measurement. We have individual partners like TapAd and Drawbridge that can, even Foursquare, that can tell you if someone saw an ad that they ran and walked into a store. Again, the measurement is probabilistic sometimes it's deterministic, sometimes it's just total volume of people who walked into a store because of media and not necessarily media lift. So I think there's more nuances there, but I think that's the kind of location-based tracking and attribution that's still enclosed within certain partners. I think what we'd like is for all our media to be measured with that goal along with a digital goal.
Yeah, great.